Greetings. We're going to call this meeting to order. I'm Dennis Longmire. I am chair of this year's committee overseeing the College of Criminal Justice's Distinguished Lecture Series. And before we get started and before our current guest is introduced, a couple of housekeeping tasks need to be taken care of. Make sure that you've turned off all of those noisy devices that you think are desperately necessary in life today. We have a special mechanism set up so that if you haven't turned it off within 10 seconds of this announcement, your phone will catch on fire, your PDF will turn upside down. So please turn off all of your cell phones. I'm going to ask that you hold questions till the end of the session unless Dr. Tittle overrides this request, at which time he's in charge as soon as I sit down and Matt finishes introducing him. But and also, I'll try to remember to remind you of this, but at the end when we begin question and answering, if you will speak very, very loud when you ask your questions, your question might get picked up by one of the mics. And I'm also going to ask Dr. Tittle to try to rephrase the question before he answers it, because this is being videoed and it will become available. And sometimes the question answer session is somewhat comical because no one knows what question is being answered. So if we can kind of preface your answer, Dr. Tittle, with a little bit of a statement of your understanding of the question at least. Also, to remind all of the doctoral students that immediately following this session there is going to be an informal colloquium in the Texas room, and after the colloquium is finished at noon, we will go into C Java and get something to eat and take what you get to eat back to the Texas room. And so we'll eat in the Texas room as well. That way we can continue the conversation that you began during your informal colloquium. There will be a sign-up sheet somewhere in C Java, and plus just make sure to sign it so that Dean Webb will pay for it. And so hopefully that'll take care of everything. And my formal role other than that is just to introduce Dr. Matt Nobles, who is actually going to formally introduce today's Beto lecturer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Longmire. Thank you all for being here. Good morning. The Beto Chair series was established in 1979 as an endowed chair in honor of Dr. George J. Beto. For 30 years, top scholars in criminology and criminal justice have visited Sam Houston State to enrich our faculty, students, and staff. Today, we're very pleased to host Dr. Charles Tittle. Since he completed his PhD in sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. Tittle has held faculty positions at various universities, including Indiana University Bloomington, Florida Atlantic, a visiting professorship at the University of Maryland, and at Washington State University. He's been a very active and prolific scholar, boasting 16 book chapters, 4 books, including 1995's Control Balance Toward a General Theory of Deviance, which was the recipient of 1997's Michael J. Hendelang Distinguished Scholarship Award from the American Society of Criminology, and the 1998 Albert J. Rees Distinguished Scholarship Award from the American Sociological Association. Dr. Tittle has almost 100 peer-reviewed articles and reprints, and more than 60 conference presentation and author meets critic panels. Perhaps even more substantially, he has a lifetime of service to our field with more than 20 published book reviews, appointments to numerous professional service committees. He has served as a referee for more than 40 academic journals. He has been a member of 12 professional or editorial boards and served as the editor for Criminology from 1992 to 1997. Dr. Tittle has a career of excellence and accolades, including some of the highest honors in criminology, such as being named an American Society of Criminology Fellow in 1992. He's also received the Edwin H. Sutherland Award for a career of distinguished scholarship from ASC in 1998. Since 2000, he's occupied the Goodnight Glaxo Wellcome Distinguished Chair of Social Science at NC State, and he remains very active in research and teaching at all levels. It's my privilege and my pleasure to welcome today's Beto Chair lecturer, Dr. Charles Tittle.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. Very happy to be here. I'm quite flattered and honored to be invited to this distinguished series. I want to speak to you this morning about my latest research trend, passion, which is international surveys, and tell you a little bit about why I think they're important and the technology that I and my graduate students have developed to execute these surveys in foreign countries and what we've done with the results. First question that a lot of people raise is whether criminology really needs international data or not. I've heard certainly public officials raise that question because they tend to think of practical applications, and they say, well, what do we care whether what they do about crime in Russia? We're interested in what you do about crime in North Carolina. And so the point of international surveys for a lot of people is just not obvious. So I want to justify just a moment of why I think they're important and why I turned to doing them as this late in my career. There are a lot of ways to divide up our work in criminology, and many people have done it. Some people say, well, there are 3 kinds of criminology, there are 2 kinds of criminology, there are 15 kinds of criminology, wherever, and people are trying to divide what we do up into different parts and so on. I want to parse our discipline too, but and of course, all these parsings we never agree about them, so you may not agree about my parsing either, but at least it gives me an orientation that works. In my mind, there are 2 major modes of doing criminology. One I call theoretical science. Those of you who've read Control Balance know that I spend quite a bit of time developing the idea of what theoretical science is all about. And I would say that approximately 40% of the criminologists, that's a rough estimate, in one way or another try to practice theoretical science. And another division of work is in solving practical problems, which we can call applied criminology, we can call it social engineering, or we can do some other term. Social engineering is the word I use, although it has a sort of a bad connotation for a lot of people. All I mean by it is that it's criminology that's applied to solving practical problems. And practical problems are usually thought of as something local. That is, you have a crime increase in Raleigh, for example, and people say, well, that's a practical problem that ought to be dealt with. And so the idea is you study Raleigh, you study what Raleigh police do and what the courts do and so on in North Carolina, and presumably through practical applications, solving the problem, we can use our knowledge and our research to address those issues. So the social engineering aspect includes a lot of things. It includes policy work of various kinds, evaluation work, which you're familiar with, some abstract thinking about the logical basis of social life and crime, but most of the social engineering or practical application has to do with local situations, and it's really irrelevant whether we have general theories or whether they work or they don't work, because if the issue is what to do about traffic in Dallas, it's very likely that people concerned with that problem are not much interested in what the research evidence on social learning theory says, or what the research evidence on strain theory says, or what the research evidence on control balance says, because to most people it's irrelevant to that issue. From such an orientation, it's pretty clear that international data are not high priority for that kind of orientation. And I sort of summarize my characterization of the view of most of the legislators in North Carolina. I haven't heard anyone say these exact words, but it's a paraphrase of the attitude that I encounter, basically saying, it doesn't matter to us, and we don't understand why you would spend your time, and we certainly don't want to fund it to study things in other countries. We want you to study things that are relevant to our lives right here. So that's one orientation to our work. Another orientation, which I call theoretical science, tries to develop explanations for things that transcend local situations. The ultimate objective of theoretical science is to build a general theory, an abstract one, of course, that contains within it sufficient causal connections and contingencies so that one can apply those general principles to lots of different situations. And the way theoretical scientists do their work, of course, is they derive hypotheses from these theories, and a hypothesis being a statement of relationship. And when we get ready to test those hypotheses, of course, we're dealing with specific localized data, but the theory themselves are at an abstract level, presumably applying to all circumstances, all people, and all places, with the exception of the contingencies that are built into the theory itself. Okay, so the goal of theoretical science, which I defined as my motivating philosophy, is to build general theories that are applicable in all circumstances. So presumably, if you have really good general theory, it will not only explain criminal behavior in Russia, but it'll explain it in Washington, D.C., and in Huntsville, Texas, and any other place. And not only will it explain criminal behavior of a white-collar variety, but also of a street variety. And not only will it explain criminal behavior among the lower status people, but also high status people. And we want these theories to be confirmed or confirmable. Otherwise, they're just ideas. We want to make sure that they correspond to the empirical world and that they're correct. Okay, from this point of view then, the point of view of theoretical science, we not only are interested in international data, but our work requires it, because if you have a theory that purports to be universal in its applicability and general, then to check that out, you have to have instances from all kinds of circumstances in order to find out whether that argument is in fact universal, or whether it turns out being dependent on a number of circumstances. So the challenge always for people working in the theoretical science field is to stretch the limits of theories to see where they apply and where they don't apply. Provide a challenge, basically, for them. And in that respect, from a point of view of the way I do my work, international data are almost ideal, because at this point in criminology, we have books and books and books and piles and piles and piles of empirical studies, mostly from the United States or Canada, or to some extent England and Australia, but almost all is in Western societies. The non-Western data we have is primarily from Asia, Taiwan, a little bit from China, but not too much. Okay, so international research, in my mind, is absolutely essential, and yet we don't have very much of it. And most of our general theories that we think is good, we don't know because we don't have those challenging tests that would check out their limits and their specific applicability. If you read Ron Akers' books on theory, for example, particularly his statements about social learning theory, social learning theory is the ultimate general theory, and Ron thinks that it's been totally confirmed, and yet even he recognizes that there's not much international data concerning social learning theory. And in one of his recent works, he actually called for more international data to put it to the test. So I and my colleagues actually took that as a challenge, and one of our surveys devoted to social learning theory. Okay. I'm not, however, what's called an internationalist. In the ASC, we have a division called International Criminology. The people in that division or that section tend to think of international research as somehow unique and different than research that's not from a foreign country. And typically, the idea is that it will be descriptive work and that it will be a great deal of qualitative input. The reason I don't count myself in that group is because I think of research in international context is like any other research. We use the same logic of cause, we use the same methods, etc. We do have to make some adjustment for peculiarities in the culture that we are examining, and that's part of the challenge of doing international surveys, but it's not a different methodology, it's not a different logic of analysis, it's not unique in that sense. It's simply another kind of data that we use in evaluating and estimating the accuracy of our general theories. Okay, so to meet this need, in the last few years, I have been conducting random sample household surveys in different places where I could, and I'll explain to you what it means to be able to do it and not be able to do it. So far, we've attempted 10 of these surveys, and we've succeeded in 8 cases. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about where those surveys were done. I have a team first, made up of me and some former graduate students. My team includes Katya, we call her Katya Bochkovar, a Russian woman. Olena Antanasio, who is a Ukrainian woman but married to an Italian man. So that's why her name is Antanasio instead of whatever it was. John Brower, who is now at the University of Nebraska. Katya is at Northeastern. Olena is at University of Miami. And we've had the help of a Greek colleague named Maria Criminology and a man that currently is on a faculty of a university in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'll tell you a little bit how I came to make those kinds of connections, but we started off trying to do a survey in a city in Russia called Nizhny Novgorod, which is about 150 miles southeast of Moscow. It's a very traditional Russian city. In fact, it's always been regarded as the repository of genuine Russian culture, whereas Moscow is thought to be quite westernized. So the Novgorod turned out to be a pretty interesting place for us. But first survey we did was there, and it was not a random one. It started out being a random, but didn't end up that way. It ended up to be sort of a convenience sample. But we learned a lot from it, and so we took some of those lessons that we learned from it, and then we did a simultaneous survey, the same instrument in 3 different languages in 3 different countries, one in that same city of Nizhny Novgorod, 500 cases, this time random selection and actual execution. Second, Live Ukraine, which is also regarded as sort of the repository of Ukrainian culture. We have 500 cases there, and then we have 400 cases in Athens, Greece. More recently, we have a set of 3 simultaneous random household surveys in Bangladesh, Dhaka, which is the main city in Bangladesh, 500 cases. Another survey in the city of Liv, Ukraine, and then we, this last one had a rural area in the Liv region, but at least 40 miles from Liv itself. So we wanted a rural-urban comparison as well as an international comparison. And this latest survey was devoted to a test of differential coercion social support theory, which is developed, of course, by Frank Cullen and Mark Colvin. So this latest 3-country survey had as its center point the testing of social support coercion theory, which, as you know, has barely been tested at all, certainly not on the individual level. There have been mostly tests of ecological types of units using various kinds of measures of social support or coercion at the collective level. Okay, in addition to these, Bochkovar, Antanasio, and another former student of mine, Laura Hughes, have conducted a household survey in both Liv and Nizhny Novgorod, in which they broke the cities up into neighborhoods and have separate samples of those neighborhoods in those 2 cities so that they could get at issues like collective efficacy and whether it works in other cultures as well as those in the United States and so on, because it's become such a popular concept through the use of through the work of Rob Sansman, who is a pretty good salesman for his own work. Our next project that's planned is a longitudinal survey in Ukraine and in Bangladesh with a 2-year time frame between the 2. We haven't really begun this one yet. We're thinking through it, but it poses some extra challenges besides those that I want to tell you about that characterize normal international surveys. Okay, how did I get into this? Early on in my career, I tried to do an international survey back in the 1960s in South Africa. I had a colleague at Indiana University, a fellow named Austin Turk, many of you may know. He was married to a South African woman, and her father was a professor at one of the South African universities. So through those connections, I was able to work up a plan to study deterrence in South Africa, which would have been my first effort 45 years ago, I guess, to do international survey. Well, the State Department of the United States government intervened and said, that's too sensitive, we can't allow you to do this study in South Africa. So I sort of shelved this whole business of international surveys until about 8 years ago. 8 years ago, I had this Russian woman walked into my office one day and said that her husband was a mathematician. He was pursuing a PhD at NC State. She wanted to study in the sociology program, but her master's degree was from an Eastern university, and the registrar's office did not know how to evaluate her credentials, so she could not be admitted to the graduate program unless she took a couple of courses and proved herself. And she was interested in taking my course in theory. So she did, and she turned out to be quite a good student. And it turns out that every summer she would go back to Russia to visit with her family. So I said to her about the second or third year she was in grad school, I said, well, what do you do back there after you've greeted everybody and gotten caught up? She said, well, not much. And I said, well, why don't you do a survey? Why don't you collect some dissertation data? So we cooked up a survey that we drew a random sample. We developed the instrument. We had it all printed up and boxed up to be shipped to Russia. And so she goes to do this one summer. Well, it turned out to be a major disaster. The disaster, one after another. One problem was none of the instruments ever arrived. Finally, when she came back to the United States, about December of the next year, that box came back with all of those survey instruments that had never arrived in Russia, or if it did, it got put somewhere, we don't know where it went. So she didn't have any instruments or materials to do her survey with, but she's a very resourceful woman. So she had one copy of the survey. So she would go do an interview, she would run home and transcribe it and erase it, and then go back and do another interview. So what was planned to be a survey of about 500 people, randomly selected, ended up being 200 people that she could get through hook or crook. Another problem she ran into was they were having an election in Novgorod at that time. Russia being new to democracy, there were lots of candidates. Apparently there were about 40 candidates for these offices, local offices. And they were mostly the kind of campaign they were doing, they were knocking on doors. And the people had gotten to the point where they wouldn't answer their doors because thought it was another candidate trying to get them to vote for them. And so Katya, not being alert to that, had planned her survey just about the time all this campaigning was going on. It's hard enough to get into residences in Russia anyway because so many people live in large apartment houses. And you can't just walk in the front door. You have to have ID and so on to get in the front door. So this was an issue for her. So she ended up doing sort of haphazard stopping people on the streets and in shopping malls. But the data turned out to be quite interesting, and we actually wrote 3 or 4 articles and finally got them published out of that. But we said to ourselves, we can do better than this, and we did do better later. But my second experience was with this Ukrainian woman who came to our graduate school probably 2 years after the Russian woman did, and she, of course, became chums with the Russian woman because they could speak common language. Olena, being Ukrainian, could also speak Russian. So they became fast friends, and Katya said, well, you should work with Charles and do a survey in Ukraine because we figured out how to do them. and we'll help you. So we did, and she not only has worked with me on a number of these surveys over time, but she actually collected her dissertation data with a survey of young people in the schools like they do in delinquency studies in so many places in the United States, but it had never been done in Ukraine. And so she was able to do that. And then the last sort of happenstance that got me firmly into the international survey business was a fellow named Islam Zaki, who was an architecture student in the School of Design at NC State. He was planning a very interesting dissertation having to do with the study of play space that children in Dhaka have. He had a theory or a hypothesis that children who didn't have enough space to play in didn't have good social development and so on and so forth. So he wanted to test this, but he didn't know how to do it. He was an architecture student. So first he came and took my undergraduate class in urban sociology and then told me what he was interested in doing and asked if I'd serve on his dissertation committee. And I did, and by and by he got finished, but in the process we became quite acquainted, and he agreed to be my foreign consultant for a study in Bangladesh. So through all of these sort of happenstances, I sort of got hooked up with people who knew something about some local cultures and knew something about criminology, and also had language skills that they could work in both English and the native language, so they could either do direct translations or check on the quality of translations. Okay, so all of these sort of happenstances with my students led me to consider this as something a lot of people ought to be trying to do. And then after we conducted our first actual random sample household, I discovered that the data were pretty good, and amazingly so, because most people that I talk to about international surveys, they say, oh, the data must be horrible because only Americans give true answers, everybody else is dishonest, or those Russians, the police will come and confiscate the data and distort it, and on and on and on. But we found that the quality of the data, by all the ways in which you normally measure quality of data, are actually very good. Another thing that persuaded me to pursue this line of work is the discovery of how economical it is to do surveys in many foreign countries. As those of you who do surveys know, in the United States, it usually costs about $150 an interview to do a survey. In Russia, which was the first one I contracted for with a survey organization in Nizhny Novgorod, the cost was $8 per interview, and that included the taxes that the Russian government skimmed off. So basically the interview was being done for about $6. Compare that to the minimum of $150 in the US, and you realize, well, shoot, you can finance one of these surveys yourself if you are passionate about your research, and it doesn't take very much money. And I happen to have some money connected with my endowment at North Carolina State. That endowment has now run out, so I'm no longer that distinguished professor. You still call me that, I appreciate it, but actually I'm not. I'm just a regular professor now. But anyway, at the time that I was in that chair position, which lasted for 10 years, there was research money associated with it. It wasn't a lot of research money, but it was enough that I could gin up every year or two one of these foreign surveys and pay for it out of the endowment. So, and this experience in Russia was not unique, because in Ukraine the cost was about the same. I paid slightly more, about $9 or $10 per interview in Bangladesh. The one I did in Athens, Greece, we wanted a Western type nation to contrast with these former Soviet republics and the Bangladesh experience. The cost for interviews in Athens was $48 an interview, about a third of what it costs in the United States, although 8 times more what it costs in Russia, or 5 or 6 times what it costs in Russia. Okay, so what are the problems that have to be overcome? First practical problem, IRB. How many people know what IRB means? Most of you. Well, all universities in the United States these days have something called an institutional review board, whose job it is to keep an eye on the research that the faculty is doing to make sure that we don't violate any rules of human rights, that we practice informed consent, and so on and so forth. These are necessary because the federal government specifies that you can't get any federal money if you don't have an IRB and if they aren't following the rules that are specified by the federal agency that's in charge of this business. So first thing you have to do is get IRB approval. In the case of foreign research, that's tough because the ability to guarantee informed consent becomes quite problematic, at least in the eyes of the IRB at NC State, and they were particularly concerned about this. Not only that, but recently, 3 years ago, apparently federal regulations changed so that if you're doing research in a foreign country, you not only have to get IRB approval in your local university, you have to get IRB approval in the country where you're doing the work. Well, this, of course, assumes that other countries have IRBs. It assumes they even know what they are, and so on. And then if they do, what incentive do they have to review your proposal, because it has no connection with federal money for them there. So this was the first challenge and continues to be a challenge. In Bangladesh, for example, the universities don't have IRBs. The only IRBs are connected with medical facilities, hospitals, where people might want to do medical research. The local IRB at NC State said, why don't you go get one of them to review your proposal? And of course, I shudder to think what doctors and nurses would say about a survey instrument, because they don't know anything about it. They know about experiments and clinical trials and things like that. So I didn't want to do that. First place, I don't know why they would have agreed to do it, because you're not allowed to pay them. That's also one of the IRB rules. You can't pay somebody to provide a review. It has to be voluntary because they don't want you bribing local officials to approve your research. So I thought I was stuck, but spent a few days on the internet and talking to as many people as I could about these things, and I finally came in contact in Dhaka with the provost at the Independent University of Bangladesh, who it turns out is an adjunct professor at Harvard. And I didn't know he was provost when I was talking to him. I thought he was a regular professor of psychology. But anyway, I explained my situation to him, and he was kind enough to appoint an ad hoc IRB to review my proposal. And I said, well, this is really generous, but I don't know how I can compensate you because I'm not allowed to pay the university or do anything like that. And he said, well, just remember that you owe IUB something. Sometime in the future, you should either come and teach a course for us, you should come and tell us the result of the survey. You should come and consult with our students. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'll leave it to your good nature, but don't forget, somewhere down the road, you owe IUB, and I still owe them. And I keep thinking about this, and I sort of am planning to go back this next summer and deliver my obligation. Now, the IRB issue was similar in Ukraine, but it was easier to solve because they actually do a little more of these academic research in Ukraine. So they did have IRBs connected with the universities. Same in Russia. I set out to do a survey in Armenia. They also have IRB. In fact, at the Armenian University of America, they actually have a survey organization plus an IRB that's appointed from the faculty at there. In Greece, they have IRBs because it's a normal situation where researchers have to pay attention to these things. But there are lots of places in the world where they don't have IRBs. Some of those places I'd actually like to do a survey. I don't know if it'll be possible to do that, but I'm always have my eyes out to see what we can do. Particularly interested in different kinds of cultural contexts that will pose challenges to the theories that we're addressing. Okay, second issue that you have to deal with in these international surveys is how do you contract for this stuff? My university, and probably yours too, won't let you make a personal contract with somebody. These contracts have to be made through a contracting office where they apply whatever the standards are that go into the contracts for the state. In this case, the state of North Carolina. And of course, the country you're working in wants the contract written in their language, and my contract office wants it written in English. So we have to develop two versions, English side by side with Ukrainian or Russian or whatever it is. But who knows whether the Russian says what the English says. You just really don't have any way to know because most people working in contracting offices, of course, don't speak that language. Part of contracts are always, what do you do if somebody fails to fulfill their obligation? I contract for surveys with a formal survey organization at a certain price, and suppose they don't do what they say they want to do, and I want to sue them. How do I do that? Do I sue them in a Russian court? Do I sue them in a North Carolina court? If I sue them in a Russian court, because this is a state contract, that means that the state attorney general or his office has to argue this case. And as they said to me in the contract office, our attorney general is a guy named Roy Cooper. The guy in the contracts office says, I'll guarantee you Roy Cooper is not going to Ukraine to argue in a Ukrainian court if there's a dispute about this contract. Well, the way it turns out, many of these foreign countries, these survey organizations that they have are sufficiently interested in your business that they'll make the contract to your specifications, and you can write it, and we write it in both languages and have an independent interpreter to make sure it says the same sort of thing. The availability of a professional survey organization is a third issue. I was surprised to learn that many countries in the world actually do have professional survey organizations with staff who are trained in survey technology in United States universities, where they have big survey organizations, many of them University of Chicago and different places. Not every country, of course, has this, but many do. They make a living by doing business surveys or surveys for the United Nations. The biggest customer for survey organization internationally is the UN, who's always surveying about health and poverty or whatever. So The fact they have one doesn't necessarily mean they're good, though, and this becomes an issue. Can you find professional organization that you can hire to do the survey that you design? The alternative, of course, is to round up trained personnel and go over and do it yourself. But I shudder to think of all of the issues that would entail, and it'd certainly be a lot more expensive than dealing with a professional survey organization. Okay, a fourth issue that has to be solved, cultural peculiarities that must be taken into account in planning surveys or in wording items. The example I gave you before, when Katja tried to do her first survey and the election going on, is a local peculiarity that has to be taken into account. And I'm over here and 3,000 miles away, or 4,000, or whatever it is. I don't know what's going on, so I can't very well make good plans about that. So you pretty much always have to have at least one consultant who is native to that country, and who, in addition to being native to that, has good English skills, can translate the language back and forth, and third, knows enough about criminology to know what we're trying to do here, and so that they don't arbitrarily change the words to sort of make it fit the language better, but at the same time lose the meaning. So far, I've been able to find such a consultant. In Greece, I ended up working with a woman that I didn't actually know, but I had corresponded quite frequently with her by email because she was writing a book on theory and was including a chapter on control balance, and was having some difficulty and wanted a Cliff's Note version. So we were corresponding back and forth about it, and so eventually I enlisted her to be my Greek consultant. She didn't know much about surveys, but she was so enthusiastic. She drove them crazy down at the survey organization. She went down there every day when they would open up. She would go in and watch them, and go out to the households and watch the interviews and watch them like a hawk. So that turned out to be pretty good, despite the fact that I didn't know her. Okay, the consultant not only has to alert you to peculiarities in local culture, but warn you and make sure that the instrument doesn't include taboo words. There are certain things that we do in the United States in surveys that are routine, but in a country that doesn't have many surveys, and certainly no surveys on crime and deviant behavior, people are not ready to hear those things. But you don't know it unless someone who's familiar with the local culture can identify that and point that out. Many things about the Muslim religion, for example, I didn't understand, and this fellow Zaki Islam that was helping me with the DACA survey was able to pick out things. He said, this is just not relevant in DACA because it is contrary to the religious practice, religious belief. And I mean, you can ask this question, nobody will throw you out, but it will be an irrelevant question because it doesn't make any sense to Muslims. So that sort of thing you need from the consultant. Okay, what about translation? How do we get it right? The way we did it, we prepared the instrument in English. We pre-tested in English with as many local people we could find that were of that native country. For example, in Raleigh, surprisingly, there are 2 or 3 dozen Russian people. So we did our pre-test for the Russian survey with those people. There are probably 10 or 12 Bangladeshis. There are a number of Ukrainians and certainly a lot of Greeks and so on. And if you know about those communities, you can use them for pretest. But we prepared the instruments in English, and then we had our translators, who were either our consultants or independent translators. the consultant would always go over the work of an independent translator to make sure that the jargon or the peculiar words that we use in criminology made sense in the native language, got translated correctly. The next step is to have someone in the native country who speaks English back translated. So it goes to them in the native language. We've already translated from English to Russian or whatever. We pre-test it with Russians. We send the instrument to be reviewed by a translator in Russia. That translator who translates it back to English for us, and then I compare the original English version with the back translation. When there are discrepancies, of course, they have to be figured out, and has to be figured out in consultation with the people who know the Russian culture as well as the U.S. culture. Okay, pretest. As I mentioned, we pre-tested our instruments with local populations that we could round up, but we also pre-tested them with people in the countries. And the issue always in pre-test is, at what point do you do pre-test? Do you do it early on and then modify your instrument as you go along, or do you do it near the end and then sort of treat the instrument as if it's the one you're going to use, but be looking for problems in it? I tend to favor the latter approach, that the pretest comes near the end, but always with flexibility to change it in light of what you learn from local population. And you have to build in those pretests, by the way, in your contracts. And that's separate. So if you want 500 cases, but you want a pretest, you want 20 or 30 cases pretest, you treat that as a separate issue, and you pay for those in addition to the 500 responses you get. Okay. How to overcome anxiety about anonymity, which we thought would be a big problem. It wasn't. We thought people in Ukraine and Russia would be worried. They weren't. It was like, this is a new experience. We never heard of a survey. This is interesting. You've come to talk to me about my life and my experiences, and talk to me about crime, and this is really, really interesting. And they were eager. And not only that, but we had a procedure for dealing with so-called sensitive information, that is self-reports of criminal behavior and moral feelings and things, which was in the form of a questionnaire. And the respondent was given a questionnaire in an envelope with an ID number on it, but nothing else. So they moved out of the presence of the interviewer, filled out this very brief questionnaire, sealed in the envelope, and put it in a big satchel so that it was just in with all the rest of them. Of course, the ID number enabled us to connect it with the rest of the interview, but there were no names that police or anybody could connect with it to confiscate the data. But apparently this procedure, while it was a good thing to do, I think it wasn't really necessary, because people were not near as worried about anonymity in these foreign countries as they are in the United States. In the United States, we're all paranoid or obsessive about our privacy, and everybody's worried about anonymity, but that apparently is not true in all parts of the world. But nevertheless, if you're going to do these surveys, you build this in, and it looks good to your IRB. And if there is a problem, then it sort of is a solution to it. But it's not a solution when you have a lot of illiterate respondents. And that's the story in Bangladesh. You have a 40% illiteracy rate in Bangladesh. So the interviewer is interviewing someone and posing questions, and they're answering, that's fine. But then you give them a little written questionnaire that's supposed to takes 3 or 4 minutes, but they can't read it. So now you have the issue of what to do. And of course, you have to work in your contract. You have to write in what's supposed to happen in a case like that. And the interviewers are, of course, supposed to be trained to help without leading or guiding the answers. But how good the How good the answers come out of that, we don't know. The overall checks on the quality of the data are like astonishingly good. I'm amazed, but I just don't know what happens in that dealing with those illiterates, because we didn't have enough observers that we were able to observe very many of those. So I don't know how that worked out. Okay, we had procedures to incentives for people to participate. One, it was a financial incentive, which, because all of these countries except Greece, and even now Greece is in the same category of people struggling economically, but the small financial incentive that we offered them was quite attractive to them. It wasn't large enough to be thought of as a bribe, but it was large enough to be worth doing for them. So that's sort of an essential thing to do. And it turned out that the natural interest in surveys in areas where surveys are almost unknown was an inspiration in and of itself to entice participation. And again, people in the countries we looked at least are not near as nervous about this, I guess, as people in the United States are. Because in the United States, we do surveys, we're routinely worried about whether people will tell us their true income or tell us these private things or feel that their anonymity or privacy has been violated, but not such a big deal elsewhere. How do you check the accuracy? Well, we do this the way you do any survey, which is you check any independent sources you have. Some things in the survey should match with census data. Some things should match with government documents of various kinds. The United Nations has all kinds of reports of rates of this, that, and the other. There are observations by visitors and journalists who are familiar with the area, and so on. All of these checks indicated to us the data were pretty good. In fact, I would argue that they are as good as any survey data on crime and deviance anywhere in the world. I probably couldn't prove that, but my experience with the data suggests that, gives me a lot of confidence in it. Of course, you look for patterns of consistency and inconsistency. You compare with similar surveys in other parts of the world. This poses a little problem, however. Suppose you find, you say, well, most surveys indicate that peer influence is related to self-reports of criminal behavior. And so you look to see if that's true in your data, and suppose all the other surveys practically in the world indicate that relationship, and yours doesn't. Now you've got a dilemma, because you say, uh-oh, either these data are no good, or the pattern of peer association as a explanatory link for criminal behavior doesn't work in the local environment. So that becomes then the interpretive challenge that you have to deal with. Finally, one issue has to do with sampling callbacks and calculating response rates. The way we did our surveys, we did not pay for callbacks. We drew a random sample the way you normally do, but we oversampled randomly, so that we started out with a pool about 3 times as large as we wanted to end up with. So we wanted 500 interviews in Russia. So we drew a random sample of 1,500 people of Nizhny Novgorod, which is a city of about 2 million people. So additional random set. So when the interviewers would go to the door, if they could not get in, they couldn't find anybody at home, and most of these calls were during the day, so anybody who was out during the day, if you don't have a callback procedures and pay people extra to go back at night, then you're going to have to move on to a random replacement. So the issue becomes, what is a response rate in this case? Because if you can't find people at home, or you can't get in the apartment building, do you count that as a what? Just a failure at the target, or do you count that as an inaccurate sample, or whatever? Our surveys ended up being about 65 or 70% replacements. In other words, the original targeted set, about 2/3 of the people originally targeted set, we couldn't find them, or we found them and they refused, or something like that. And so we put in a random replacement for those. So when we were sending these papers out for review, of course, many of the reviewers are obsessed with random samples. I don't know why they are, because it's almost never the case that anybody ever has a true random sample. But because these were foreign surveys that people are suspicious of anyway, the reviewers will give us a hard time about this. They say, well, it's a very low response rate. You have 2/3 refusal. Well, no, they're not refusals. We just couldn't find the target person, and there is a random replacement. But of course, a random replacement deviates somewhat from total randomness, so you get an issue like that. How do we calculate response rates? How many of you see them in journals? I never see them. The only time anybody said anything to me about response rates is when I sent one of my foreign surveys to a journal for a review. And then almost inevitably they raise the question of response rates. But if I use Survey Data in the United States, which I have done quite a bit, this never comes up. Your response rate never comes up. So the suspicion about foreign data makes it come up, but I don't think anybody's ever figured out, because there are so many different ways to calculate the response rate. You make yourself look good, or you make yourself look bad, or you can provide all the information and confuse everybody. But that's part of the problem there. Okay. Now, conclusion. The way I work, which is to build and test theories, requires international data. We haven't traditionally had a lot of it in criminology, so I, along with some happenstance that put me in touch with some people from foreign countries, I sort of decided, well, I ought to do something about that. I ought to set an example. If I'm going to argue that we need this international data, I really ought to show people how to do it. It's always been my belief that you don't tell people what to do, you lead them to do it. Those of you who read Control Balance, you know that the purpose of the book was to tell people how to build theory. When I got that part written, I said, well, wait a minute. I should show them how to do it. I have to give them an example. Otherwise, I'm not being true to my commitment here. So I invented Control Balance theory, which some of you have read and been interested in, simply as an illustration of how to do something I've been trying to teach people how to do. Okay, so I take my own admonition about international surveys seriously, and I've tried to develop technology for doing it. I'm convinced that we can do it, and we can do it well, and we can do it fairly inexpensively. So I'm inviting you, come do it. And if you can't do it on the basis of what I've told you today, call me up, email me. I'll help you do it, because I'd like to see this become a regular part of our literature, particularly the part of the literature that has to do with theory building and theory testing. Thank you.
This is the most exciting time, especially for the doctoral students, because you know that we evaluate you based upon the quality of questions that you ask for our distinguished lecturers. So I'm going to allow Dr. Tittle to manage and monitor the question and answer session, reminding you, Dr. Tittle, to try to remember to repeat or rephrase the question. And if you have any questions, please indicate so. Take off.
In the back row.
Do you think the issues that you have in your international surveys are unique to where those countries were at, or do you think you'll have the same issues if you targeted countries in like South America?
Well, it's probably some of both. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. She asked me if the issues or problems that identified in doing international surveys were general to all international surveys or were they peculiar to the places that we were studying. And the answer is probably some of both. After all, there are cultural variations. We know that. And what the peculiarities of a given area are partly historical and partly cultural, so it's going to vary some with that. But there's also some quite general principles, I think, that operate. And I've tried to sort of skim off the general problems from the local ones. And the local ones sometimes come up in the process of working with the local survey organization, doing your pretest, working with your consultant. You find out different things. When we were in Russia, for example, we were struggling with how to measure SES, which is such an important variable in American criminology, as you know. But my consultant kept saying, well, SES does not mean the same thing in Russia, because when Russia was part of the Soviet Union, the whole notion of income, occupation, and education did not fit together in the way that it's assumed that they do in American society, because many people were able to get resources that didn't match their occupational achievement or their educational achievement through corruption. And many people were placed in jobs and occupations by central authorities, independent of anything else, and so on. So this is a local problem. How do we measure SES then? So the solution that we came up with was we would ask a series of questions about what people normally use in everyday life and to what extent the respondent could afford that thing. And we had groceries, the groceries you need for your family, the drugs you need for illnesses, to take a vacation, to own a home, to travel somewhere out of the country for a vacation, a series of these kinds of questions. And then we took the answers and see if they would fit a cumulative scale, a Gutman type scale, and they did. So this measure of SES is a consumption ability measure, which bypasses the whole problem with defining SES in Russia. And of course, we were doing comparisons, so we had to do the same thing in Greece, we had to do the same thing in Ukraine. But at the end, it looked pretty cool, because the cumulative scale worked out sort of beautifully, and some of the results I thought were consistent with U.S. literature, but many of the reviewers don't. As you know, SES crime relationship is controversial, has been for a number of years. You might recall that I wrote a paper once arguing that it was a myth, that there was a negative relationship between SES and crime, which activated a lot of response and so on. But by now, almost everybody treats this as a not such a firm conclusion. In fact, most people treat it now as quite problematic. And in Russia, we find that SES, the way we measured it, is not negatively related, which is consistent with a lot of U.S. literature. Moreover, we found that it was positively related, that in post-Soviet Russia, higher status is associated with greater criminality. Well, right away, reviewers say, well, that's because you have a stupid measure of SES. You should have a traditional measure, but the traditional measure doesn't mean anything. So what do you do? else can I answer for? Yes, over here.
I'm just wondering what recommendations you might have for future researchers to develop these contacts, to establish having a coordinator or a consultant in one of these countries.
Okay, Meredith asked the question, what recommendation I have for how to identify a consultant or find someone to work with in some foreign country that can help you on these surveys. Obviously, students that you're going to have will be your first source. Any major university these days has lots of foreign students from all over the world. And I have no doubt that you do here at SAM. And certainly when I was at UT Austin, we had students from all over the world, particularly the Arab world. And so in the normal scheme of things, you'll have students like this in your class. If they're bright and smart, you get acquainted with them and talk about this. For instance, we had a young man from Mexico who worked in our department for a while, very bright, did a lot of computer work for us. For a while, I wanted to try to do a survey in Mexico, but I got scared because of the drug wars and so on. I didn't want to endanger research workers going to knock on doors that they don't know people and stuff. So I finally gave up on it, but I had already worked this out with Raphael because it was interesting to him, and I knew him and we could work together and so on. So right here on the campus, I'll bet you can encounter people from many countries in the world that you could potentially, and every time I meet somebody from a foreign country, I have a conversation with them, and in the conversation, we raise the issue of what do they do? Do they do surveys? Your country is a professional survey organization, da-da-da-da-da. And that's another way that you get acquainted with people like that. Ultimately, you may have to actually go look for one by contacting foreign universities. For instance, if I didn't have Zaki in Bangladesh, I've never met the provost that was so helpful to me, but I felt comfortable that I could have asked him to hook me up with one or more people who could serve as a consultant and would be interested in the data and so on. And by the way, I always offer these consultant co-authorship for the first 2 papers out of a survey. If they're somehow associated with criminology, that's quite attractive to them. But Zaki is an architect. So you'd think, well, he wouldn't care, but he did. And he was so delighted when our first pub was accepted and he was able to put on his architecture vita that he has a publication in a criminology journal. Other questions here? Jeff?
You mentioned social learning early on in your talk. I'm just really curious about what the other questions are. I know you mentioned the issue.
What are the other theories we're looking at?
Yeah.
The question is that I had mentioned social learning, and Jeff is wondering what other theories we have looked at. We have done one survey primarily oriented toward strain theory, but even though a given survey is oriented toward a main theory, it has ancillary things. So in that same strain theory, we have some questions that enable us to test some hypotheses about self-control theory. There's some questions that enable us to test some hypotheses about deterrence theory. There's some questions there allow us to test some hypotheses not connected particularly with a theory, but with relationships that have been of long-term interest in American criminology. One is religiosity and criminal behavior, which we've got some fascinating data looking at, and we're going to be able to look at the relationship between religiosity and the Muslim religion with religiosity in a Christian religion and find out, is it religiosity or is the particular content of the religion that makes a difference? So We have a number of questions in there about morality that enable us to take a look at some issues that Wickstrom has raised in his recent theorizing about what he calls situational action theory, which is really about morality. And the survey that was devoted to social support theory also has these ancillary things in it. So lots of papers can be done, and despite the suspicion of reviewers, we've actually compiled quite a good list of 10 or 12 pubs already, and we've barely started analyzing these data. And when we run into problems, it's often suspicion, and so we try to improve the next survey to make sure we can cover that the next time around. It's often have issues, as any cross-sectional research does, with causal ordering. So that's why we're planning a longitudinal survey. We don't think that the longitudinal data will show much different than the cross-sectional data, but given the current world, you have to do that. And given the current obsession with hierarchical linear modeling, you have to have two-level data. That's why my students collected these separate samples from these neighborhoods in Novgorod, Nizhny Novgorod, and Liv. So not because they thought it would show anything, because it's what you have to do these days to satisfy reviewers.
Do you envision a large-scale international theory competition out of all of this?
Well, I think that every day of our lives should be a large-scale theory competition, because at least those of us who are in those of us who are in the theory building testing side of criminology are indeed doing that. We're pitting one against the other. At least the students that I deal with and the people that I come in contact with, we try not to have favorites among these theories. I know that's hard to do, and a lot of people want you to have favorites. I've had people say, well, I meet a new person. You're a criminologist. Well, what kind of criminologist are you? Well, I hope a good one. That's not what they mean, of course. They're saying, what are you committed to? And it's pretty hard to say, well, I'm sort of trying to keep an open mind about these theories and collecting the best data I can, putting them to the test and so on. That's the way I do my work, and that's the way I teach my students. So the answer to your question is, yes, I do envision such a thing like that. In fact, I see it every day in my life, at least in my dreams. All right. Other questions? Abdul.
Then when you check for the generalizability of result to the whole Russia, is it generalizable to the one city or whole Russian population?
Okay. Abdul's question said we have samples of cities, and we have ways of checking the accuracy or the representativeness of the data for that particular city, but does it generalize to the whole country? Can we draw conclusions about the whole country? We don't know. We try to refrain from that because early on, some reviewers actually called that to our attention. They said, well, you may have a good sample of Liv, and you may be able to say some things about Liv, but you can't say much about Ukraine without some further demonstration that your sample applies there. So we're very careful about that, but it's not a problem for us because we're not doing descriptive work. We are testing universalistic hypotheses, which ought to work anywhere, anytime, for any people. In fact, part of the obsession with random samples in criminology is misplaced, because if you have a universalistic hypothesis, any sample whatsoever, as long as you have the possibility of variation in the dependent variable and you have documentable variation in the independent variable. Any sample whatsoever will be useful because negative evidence challenges a universalistic statement. And as long as there's variation in independent variable and potential variation in dependent variable, then you can perform a test. So the necessity for a random sample, even of one of these cities, is not there. But I've been around criminology long enough to know that you don't have time to educate the reviewers, so you have to play the game, and the game is you always have to report that you have a random sample of something. And people do. People will do school surveys of 2 classes in junior high. They take a random sample of those 2 classes, and then they send their paper off and say it's a random sample. And everybody says, oh, well, good, and they relax. But I say, well, wait a minute. What population can you possibly generalize to? First, you selected a school somewhere, certainly not a random selection. You selected 2 classes, not a random selection. And you did a random sample on a particular day and 5% of the class was absent. Do you really have a random sample? And so on and so forth. So, someday I may be forced to write an article along these lines because it really is an obsession that gets in the way of doing a lot of good work. Random samples are mostly appropriate when you need to describe, when you need to generalize and describe to some larger population. But if you're working with general theories that have universalistic statements, the randomness variation in the independent variables.
I think the culture itself has some, impact on crime. So I just wonder if you include any, cultural factors to see, their, effect on the crimes. So if you include any cultural factors, can you give us some examples?
Can you help me?
Cultural factors affect the responses, and did you include any cultural factors associated with the particular countries?
Did everybody hear that? The question is about cultural factors and do they influence response rates and do we take them into account? Is that right?
I mean the relationship between cultural factors and crime.
Yeah, okay. Well, clearly if you've got six surveys, which we do now, we have 7 or 8 actually, and you have similar measures of crime, but you have these cultural variations, and some of the cultural differences you actually document in the survey itself, various and sundry practices about child rearing and so on that you have built in there. But if you start out with the assumption that Russia is different from Greece, and very few people would challenge that, right? They would say there are cultural differences. We don't know exactly what they are, but they are there. So if we have these similar measures, we compare those two, then we have a beginning angle on cultural influence on crime rates. And in this particular case, it turns out that the Russian crime rate, self-reported crime rate, is very high relative to Bangladesh and relative to Greece and relative to the United States and relative to every place else in the world. This we anticipated from UN documents and police data and all sorts of things. It was sort of well known or among the folk knowledge that Russians were more violent than most people in the world, at least after the Soviet experience. And our survey data document that very clearly. The self-reported violence rates and the self-reported projected violence rates are way, way ahead of Greece and Bangladesh. But the Ukrainian crime rates are even higher than the Russians. So it fits with sort of common sense knowledge. If you read a bunch of stuff about these countries, you'll say, gee, it says here that people are not integrated with families. They're not very moral. They don't have community structures that constrain misbehavior and so on. They must have high crime rates. And then you go do the survey, and by golly, it turns out that way. You gain a lot of confidence in what you're doing. At least I do. It's like, whoa, this stuff works. Can't believe it. Surprised. Other question?
We're close enough that I'm going to call the question. No more questions. We'll give Dr. Tittle a little bit of a break between now. There's a 4-minute break between now and 11. So you all will reconvene in the Texas room at 11 and continue your discussion and expand it perhaps.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.